Hey guys, what's up? It's Collegio. So Operation Epic Fury, is this an epic opportunity to bring peace to the Middle East through regime change? Or is it an epic rabbit hole that's going to drag the United States into another forever war? I'm going to give an ultra-realist take on Operation Epic Fury, what's going on with the military operations, what it means for geopolitics in the Middle East, and whether or not we can change the regime in Iran without a land war. So we all woke up this morning to the news that the United States and Israel had launched Operation Epic Fury. There was a massive coordinated military attack on Iranian political and military targets. Iran, of course, responded by sending missiles to Israel and hitting U.S. bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and other U.S. bases. This is hot and it's escalating. And to understand what's going on today, we need a little bit of background going back to June of last year. Now, in June of 2025, Israel and Iran were engaged in this prolonged conflict. It culminated in Israel attacking Iran and a bunch of nuclear sites. Of course, the United States came in with Operation Midnight Hammer about a week after the Israelis deployed. And according to Donald Trump, through some very, very high-tech U.S. weaponry and bombs, we eradicated Iran's military program. Now, Iran says that the military program was damaged. Of course, there's no third parties that can go in and just check and see whether these nuclear programs are really destroyed. The International Atomic Energy Agency says that it was damaged, but not destroyed. So 2 days after the U.S. bombing, there was a ceasefire and peace talks began between the United States and Iran. Now, those progressed for a little while. Trump, being Trump, was looking for leverage, turned up the heat by increasing the sanctions that were on Iran. Now, this caused all kinds of problems with their economy. The economy choked, the currency devalued, and people started taking to the streets in December and January. There were massive protests across the country, and Trump told the people that they needed to rise up and retake their institutions. Now, the Iranian regime responded by blocking all of the internet, blocking Twitter or whatever communications ways the people had for showing up at certain times and protesting. And according to some sources, The Guardian and Time magazine, the Iranian regime may have killed between 30 and 35,000 protesters in December and January. So Trump said help is on the way. Help hasn't come to the rescue until yesterday, when this morning, when the military operation began. The peace talks have completely choked, and of course, this morning we woke up to all the military action. Now, a couple of observations that I think are key. The first is that Iran hits U.S. military bases, mostly in the Persian Gulf, but also throughout the Middle East. Now, a couple things. A couple of the missiles actually hit the bases. So the U.S. air defense systems are not 100% watertight. I think oftentimes we think that they were, but a couple of, at least, of these missiles actually got through. So that's one thing to note. And because they did, many of the Arab countries that house these bases responded. Now, what was interesting to me is that they all responded in a very, very similar message. They all pointed the finger at Iran for being the source of the hostilities. That tells me that they're kind of tacitly supportive of what's going on there. Iran, of course, is a destabilizing influence, not only to Israel, but also to all of the Gulf countries. Iran seeks to be the hegemon, the dominant power in the area, and is viewed as a threat by most of the wealthy countries in the Middle East. Now, that brings up a very important point, because if you talk to observers of what's gone on in the Arab countries over the last 20 to 30 years, a shift has gone on. Okay, there's a new power center in the Arab world, which are the moneyed nations of Qatar, which has all these natural gas reserves, the UAE, which also has oil and gas reserves, and the new King Saudi Arabia, MBS, who's trying to modernize their country there. These countries appear to want to get past the question of Israel. It's not to say that they like Israel, but I think that they've kind of come to the reality that Israel is there to stay, and it's just something that has to be dealt with. It's the reality of the moment. Now, on the other side of the fence, you have countries like Iraq, Syria, maybe part of the government in Egypt, who really are stuck, Lebanon, who are stuck in this position of thinking that Israel can be dealt with, all right? And if you look at what caused the October 7th, 2023 attacks, where Hamas attacked Israel, one of the causes of that, according to most commentators, was the idea that Israel was getting close to signing a peace accord with Saudi Arabia. Iran intervened by basically arming Hamas and getting them to do this attack in order to derail those talks. So this, I think kind of shows this division between the older Arab world, which is caught up in the pan-Arab nationalism of the 50s and 60s and 70s and trying to get rid of the foreign elements, trying to get rid of the Israelis, and the new Arab world, these moneyed interests in the Gulf who are just kind of viewing the reality that Israel is here to stay and they need to deal with it. So that's one thing that's going on. The other that I think is interesting is that there has to be a split in the White House over this. Okay, so of course you have on the one hand Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is also the National Security Advisor, tremendously powerful in the Trump administration. Now, Trump didn't run on having an activist foreign policy. He kind of ran against it. He talked about putting an end to forever wars. He called the Iraq the stupid war, okay? So on the other side of this, you have kind of an isolationist element in his cabinet, mostly led by J.D. Vance, but also a lot of the people who support him on the outside, Steve Bannon, Tucker Carlson, who don't want the United States to take an active role. Rubio seems to be winning this. One thing that I'll say about Trump, and I've said it over and over, is that I don't think he's particularly interventionist or isolationist. I think that I call him an opportunistic realist. And what I believe happened is Rubio and the hawkish wing of his cabinet must have shown him a plan that he bought that said that they could change this regime through excessive and dominant missiles, use of Air Force and Navy. They have not ruled out using land forces, using an army or a ground invasion, but I suspect that that's not something that Trump wants to have anything to do with. So the question is, can they actually accomplish what they want to accomplish through this air and naval campaign? So this is important because it also begs to question, well, how is this any different than what happened in Iraq 23 years ago? All right, so after September 11th, the United States builds its case that it's going to invade Iraq because Iraq was responsible for it. Of course, Iraq wasn't responsible for it. The United States is able to go in, overturn the regime, but then basically sparks a civil war that the United States can't get out of, all right? And it's very, very messy, extremely costly. And one of the questions is, are we just repeating that same stupid error that we made with the Iraq war? Now, in fairness, there are key differences between Iran and Iraq. Iraq has this crazy sectarian ethnic mix that just makes it a very, very volatile place. You have Sunni Arabs, Sunni Kurds, and Shia Arabs, all of whom have massive differences with each other. Iran is a little bit different than that. It is the country is over 90% Shia, so the sectarian issues aren't really the same. There are ethnic divisions, although the country is more than half Persian, but the ethnic groups there don't really fight, or they're not at each other's throats in the same way as the Kurds and the Sunnis and the Shias were in Iraq. So in that respect, it's different. Now, in one respect, it's actually worse. Iran is a much bigger country. It's not something that you can just take over with tanks in a couple of weeks like we did in Iraq. It's a mountainous country. There's rivers, there's gorges. And, I have to imagine that the mullahs in Iran have been planning for this moment. I mean, they know that the biggest threat to their existence is the United States. They have to have military plans of what to do when the United States invades. And I'm sure part of that is hiding the government, in some obscure area in a cave underneath a mountain that's never going to be found. So while the United States was able to go in and find and capture Saddam Hussein within 9 months of the war, I mean, who knows if they really want to keep the Ayatollah Khamenei away from U.S. forces, they may be able to do it indefinitely. I don't know that for sure, but it certainly has the potential of being much harder than it was, that aspect of it than in Iraq. So in order for this to work without a land invasion, there has to be an involvement by the Iranian people. And I think that that's why in January, President Trump asked the Iranian people to rise up, to take their institutions back. Because if the people don't lead this revolution, if they don't use the military operation as the first step in overthrowing the regime themselves, it's going to be very, very difficult for an outside power like the United States to do that. Number one, I don't think Trump's going to want to bring in troops. But number two, while we have this asymmetric advantage in naval and air power, that, and even in kind of like an armed battle on the ground with tanks and infantry, because of all of our technology, that much of that advantage goes away if the military kind of disappears into houses and suddenly we're fighting a door-to-door war like we were in Iraq. The whole advantage goes away. And I know that Trump does not want to get involved in something like that. So a successful regime change is going to require the Iranian people rising up. Now, to that extent, Reza Pahlavi, who is the heir to the former crown of Iran, the Shah's son, he has been calling for the people to rise up. And, it'd be interesting to see whether or not that happens. But there does appear to be a unity of opposition to the Iranian regime in a way that, people kind of like oppose Saddam, but there wasn't unity among the groups that oppose Saddam. The Shias oppose Saddam. The Kurds opposed Saddam, but they weren't really willing to work together to overthrow Saddam. And then as soon as Saddam was gone, it just kind of created this vacuum where there was all of a sudden a new fighting and Iraqi civil war broke out. So the hope is that the people will rise up and overthrow the regime. The worst case scenario is that the mullahs are able to hide, remotely run the government, put down revolts, and then, drag this thing on for years and years and years until there's a new president of the United States who gives up. One critical thing is that in regimes like this, you often have a Praetorian Guard, kind of a king's guard who's loyal to the regime, who's loyal to the government, but not necessarily to the people. All right, so Iraq had the Revolutionary Guard, and that was kind of like Saddam's private army. Iran has the Revolutionary Guard, which is protecting the revolution of 1979, the theocratic, Shia Islam revolution that put the mullahs into power. All right. Another thing that Iran has that Iraq didn't have is they also have this network of external kind of terrorist groups that they may be able to call back to Iran to help them. All right. Iran funds Hezbollah. It funds Hamas. It funds the Houthis in Yemen. Could they call these paramilitaries back to go fight against protesters or to fight against Americans or to create terror cells that just create chaos? Could they do that in Iran, or could they do that in other places that end up being a distraction to the United States? So you can rapidly see that while in some respects this could be easier than Iraq, in other cases it actually could be far more complicated because Iraq did not have this external kind of terrorism apparatus and network that Iran has been building literally for decades. So the other piece of this is China and Russia. Now, Russia is a long-term ally of Iran. They're kind of a client state. They provide them with a lot of their weapons. The thing about Russia right now is that they're so bogged down in Ukraine. I mean, you have to remember that just a year ago, a Ukrainian drone attack basically destroyed a big chunk of Russia's air force. So Russia just doesn't have the resources at this point to get involved, which is going to hurt the Iranian regime. There's also the question of China. China, about 15% of China's oil comes from Iran. They are also the chief purchaser of Iranian oil. So there's this question of and China is also very practical, by the way. So while they are allied with Iran, I don't know that they're ideologically, arm in arm with the Iranians. So I would expect the Chinese to kind of sit back, be very, very practical, look at the writing on the wall, and if it's possible that the regime, if it looks likely that the regime is going to change, China will probably shift into a position that embraces the new regime. So they're very, very unlikely to get involved militarily. So, but at the same time, this also does create a squeeze on China because 15% of their potential oil production could be limited indefinitely, and that could hurt them to a great degree. So what's next? All I would say is that this is a very precarious moment for the United States and for the Middle East. U.S. military strikes from the air and from the sea can only go so far. At a certain point, people at the ground level are going to need to rise up against this regime. If it sparks a new revolution that overthrows the mullah internally, that's the best case scenario. All right, we're able to overturn, hopefully they form a new government that's less destabilizing, that's less hostile to the United States and Israel, and we can have some kind of peace. Whether that's elections or not, I don't know, but just to have a regime there that's not as destabilizing as the current one, that really is the goal. Worst case scenario, they're able to put down the demonstrations, they're able to put down efforts to overthrow the government, they're able to hide the mullahs and the government, they're able to rule remotely. The country descends into civil war. Suddenly Hezbollah and the Houthis are back. They're blowing up. They're doing suicide bombings and blowing up and making all kinds of distractions, killing people in the streets. That's kind of your worst case rabbit hole scenario. That's the forever war scenario that no one wants, least of all Donald Trump. So he clearly believes that the first scenario is going to happen, that they can overthrow the regime, that they're going to be able to get the people to rise up against the regime. You have to remember that President Bush thought that they would do that in Iraq too, and that completely didn't happen. So there's a fog of war aspect here that is frankly really, really disconcerting. A lot of these things look a lot clearer and easier when you start them, and they're a lot more difficult to finish. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also very skeptical because the United States, frankly, does not have a great record when it comes to regime change. So that's my ultra-realist take. Would love to hear what you think. Watch the couple of videos that I did last summer about the history of Iran and Israel. Drop a comment and a follow. We'd love to have you follow these videos. Thanks.